Hi, everybody. I'm Audrey Siegel, the Executive Director, Beaker Hold'em of Greater Washington. And I believe that almost everybody here today is local and so doesn't need too much of an orientation or understanding about what Beaker Hold'em of Greater Washington is. But there are a couple of people I think who have joined us from other communities. Feel free if you want to raise your hand if your camera's on or put an emoji if you're not from the greater Washington area so we can see who you are. But I just, for everyone's sake and to give people a little bit more time to come in, I will introduce the sponsor of tonight's program, Beaker Hold'em of Greater Washington, is of course the local Beaker Hold'em organization serving Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. And I'll share with those of you who've joined us tonight two exciting things that we have going on in addition to this program. And that is that we are really pleased to tell you that our long-awaited 3 new hospital pantries are should be up and running, all 3 of them, I would say by next week. And that brings our total to 7. So 7 area hospitals where we're running Beaker Hold'em Hospital kosher pantries, and the 3 new ones are at Suburban Hospital, MedStar Montgomery, and Sibley. So if you know of anybody in any of these locations who needs support, there's going to be a lot more available to them. And our cooking kitchen is progressing with great speed, and also we're hoping will be finished being constructed by the end of the month, and plans are already underway to begin cooking, hopefully soon after that in March. So if you are interested in getting involved with that, if you remember, that's where we'll be going to be preparing kosher, medically tailored meals for people in hospitals and also recovering from at home. If you want to be more involved in that, if you want to volunteer, I'll put in the chat later at the end of the program a link to sign up to volunteer. And if you've already signed up to volunteer, then you can send us an email and tell us, hey, I want to get involved either in one of these pantries or in the kitchen. And now I'd like to turn our spotlight to our speaker tonight, Esty Rose, who is a certified genetic counselor and an outreach coordinator with JScreen, which I'm sure many of you know is a national nonprofit Jewish organization that focuses on Jewish genetic screening programs. I will say, Esty, that I have a son at Yeshiva University who just participated in a screening program, I think last week, very recently.
I probably met him.
Oh, you're the one who was there.
I was there,
Okay,
yeah.
great to know. Esty graduated from Yeshiva University, Stern College for Women, and then she went on to do a master's in genetic counseling at Mount Sinai. She is passionate about doing community education and outreach for individuals of her own community who are facing genetic health issues. And we actually did a program with Esty before, a few years ago, and it was very impressive and delivered such important content. But I also know that the world of genetics and genetic testing is always evolving and changing. It's not static. So what you heard 3 years ago is probably somewhat out of date today. There's a lot of new information. So we were eager to have her come back. And I am pleased to now mute myself and turn the presentation over to Esty.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. And kol hakavod to you and all that your organization does. That's really, really exciting and really impressive, all this new stuff going on. Okay, I need to be a host, I think, to share my screen. Okay, I think that should work. Okay, you see my screen? Yeah, okay, wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so as Audrey mentioned, I'm going to be speaking for a little bit about what you should know about genetic testing. And if you have any questions along the way, you can feel free to write them down or jot them down or put them in the chat. And Audrey will moderate a Q&A at the end of our conversation. I just ask that you try not to keep the questions too personal. If possible, just the more general, the better, if possible. Okay, so again, thank you for having me. I know that Audrey introduced me as a genetic counselor, but I wanted to start by giving you all a little bit more of a background about what genetic counselors do, because I don't think there's much knowledge in our community about all of the expertise that we have and all the skills that we have. And I wanted to put it out there just so that you know we exist and we're here as a resource for you. So genetic counselors are medical specialists who have a master's degree in specifically in genetic counseling. And our jobs are to explain to people when we think that there might be something genetic going on in them or in a family member. We discuss why we think there could be something going on, what we think it could possibly be. We do testing on them, and then we give them the results and explain to them what the results mean and what they can do to, get ahead of whatever those results are or to prepare for those results. Nowadays, genetic counselors are much more all over the place. It used to be that genetic counselors were really only in the prenatal realm, but now you'll see genetic counselors in the prenatal realm, in the cancer realm, pediatric medicine, many areas of adult medicine like cardiology and neurology. So as we learn more and more about genes and what kind of impact they have on diseases, there's more genetic counselors out there talking about what these genes do and testing people appropriately. Just as an example of a time somebody might see a genetic counselor, let's say there's a pregnancy going on and the doctor does an ultrasound and sees something abnormal and they think maybe the baby might have some kind of a genetic syndrome. They'll send them to the genetic counselor. We'll talk to them about why we think there could be something genetic going on. We'll order the right test for them. When the results come in, hopefully they're normal, but if they're not normal, we'll counsel them about what they mean, what this means for the baby, and what they can do with this information. I'm keeping it very general because it's very, very case specific, and the different options are just all over the place, and depending on what the situation is, there are going to be different options. Another place you might see a genetic counselor, and we'll talk about it today, is in the cancer realm. When we suspect that there might be some kind of genetic form of cancer in a family, we'll take a family history, see why it could be genetic, test them appropriately, and then talk about the results once they're in. So there are currently, I'm really proud of this, we have a Jewish genetic counselors WhatsApp group, and there are currently 70 something people on the group consisting of students in genetic counseling schools and beyond. Only a few years ago, there were like 40 something people in the group. So it's really exciting for me to see how much our profession is growing, especially in the Jewish community. And as you'll see tonight, there's a big need for us in our community. So I'm going to start by talking about reproductive carrier screening, testing for Tay-Sachs and other common diseases that could affect babies. I don't have, most people are not on their camera, so I don't know exactly who's on this call. So I will say that this part of the talk is more specific to people who are in the family planning stage of life. So this might apply to you, it might apply to your children, it might apply to your grandchildren. So even if it doesn't apply to you, listen anyway, because it's always good to nag your kids when you need to about doing things like genetic testing. So the conditions that we're going to talk about in the realm of carrier testing are mostly recessive. You might remember from biology class that recessive conditions were very famously discovered by Mendel with the pea plants and I don't know if anybody remembers this, the pea plants, all of the different colors of the pea plants and the flies going around with different wings. But basically, when somebody is a carrier for a recessive disease, they don't have any symptoms of the disease. So they have no idea that they're carriers for the disease. They're totally fine. However, when we have a carrier couple, when the guy and the girl are both carriers for the same condition, their children potentially can get a mutation from each of them. And when that happens, their child would be affected with the condition. So carriers are healthy. But carrier couples are at risk to have a child with the condition that they're both carriers for. What are the chances for that to happen? It's 1 in 4 or 25% each time they get pregnant. So, what happens in one pregnancy has nothing to do with what happens in another pregnancy. Each one is totally independent. And again, there's a 25% chance for each child of a carrier couple to be affected with that condition. We see that very often conditions are kind of like clustered to different populations. So, for example, Tay Sachs disease, I mentioned a minute ago, kind of like the classic Jewish disease, about 1 in 30 Ashkenazi Jews is a carrier for Tay Sachs disease. But we also see similar carrier rates in other ethnicities. So, you'll see it in the French Canadians, you'll see them in a very small sect of people from Louisiana called the Louisiana Cajuns. We see it in people who are Irish. Similarly, there are other conditions that we see in other populations, so not Jewish populations. For example, sickle cell disease, you'll see in African Americans, and then there's some more listed here. But my point of this slide is that very often conditions are more commonly seen in different populations of people. And it was very obvious that this was going on with Tay-Sachs. But the problem was, or is, or was at the time, that there was no good testing. There was no way for people to avoid having babies with Tay-Sachs. In the 1970s, there was an entire wing of a hospital in New York, in the Bronx, just for babies who had Tay-Sachs. So for people who are not aware, I mentioned that the carrier frequency for Tay-Sachs is 1 in 30. So 1 in 30 Ashkenazi Jews is a carrier for Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is an absolutely devastating disease. Babies who are born with it are healthy. Everything is fine. They look fine. They act fine. But by the time they're about 6 or 7 months, the parents usually start to notice that the babies are not meeting the milestones that they should be meeting at that point. They also end up regressing. They have seizures. They have blindness. And all babies who have Tay-Sachs will die by the time they're 3 or 4 years old. There is no cure for Tay-Sachs. So there were entire wings of hospitals filled with babies who were Jewish who had Tay-Sachs disease. And there were people who needed to figure out how to stop this from happening. And they did stop it from happening, or they definitely slowed it down. In the late 70s, early 80s, there were a group of scientists at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which is part of YU. And this is them. They would go around in this van and they would test people to see if they were carriers for Tay-Sachs. So at the time, the way that they would test people was not to do genetic testing like we do it today. They didn't know what genes were then. It wasn't even understood why people are getting Tay-Sachs because of genetic reasons. The way that they figured out is there's a specific enzyme that all babies who had Tay-Sachs were deficient in. They were missing this enzyme. It's called hex A. And they found that those babies who had Tay-Sachs, their parents had half the amount of normal of hex A, of that enzyme. So they figured out that if somebody has half the amount of this enzyme, they're a carrier for Tay-Sachs. So this group of people would go around in the vans. They would go around all different cities, mostly in the Northeast, going to shuls and going to schools and going to JCCs, testing people to see how much of this enzyme they had. And if they saw that you had a carrier couple, those days they didn't call it carrier couples, we're calling that now. But when they saw a couple where both the man and the woman had half the amount of that enzyme, they would advise them not to get married because they knew that when someone has half the amount of enzyme, they have babies with Tay-Sachs. Again, we know it's not 100%, it's only 25%, but at that time, that was the information that they had. Over the course of years, we learned a lot more about Tay-Sachs and many, many other genetic diseases that affect the Ashkenazi population. And we were able to do it much easier. Here you can see a timeline of all the diseases that we tested for. Starting in 2008, we went from Tay-Sachs to 8 diseases, then 18, then 36, and the number just keeps going and going. Currently, we're testing for 265 diseases. Not all of them are specific to the Ashkenazi population. Some of them are Sephardi, some of them are not even Jewish at all. They're just anyone could be a carrier for them, but we've definitely come a really long way from this going around in the vans and telling people not to get married. Now we're testing people for many more conditions, and we're no longer telling them not to get married. We're giving them many other options for building their family. And I'll get to those options in a couple of slides from now. So we've come a really long way. Did it make a difference? The answer is absolutely. So here you can see that in 1970, there were about 45 babies born with Tay-Sachs disease in the United States who were Jewish. So this green square just shows the Jewish population of Tay-Sachs babies. By 1980, that number went down to 20, and you can see it just went down and down and down. Why did it go down and down and down? Because they were going around in the vans testing people and telling carriers not to marry each other. You can see that there are also non-Jewish babies who have Tay-Sachs. That's these purple circles here. You'll notice that these numbers are not as drastically, they don't go down so much. And the reason is because in the non-Jewish population, there aren't people going around in vans. There aren't people logging into Zooms and learning about the fact that they have to get tested. There's no, big public health initiative around testing for Tay-Sachs. So people just don't know that they should be doing the screening. So unfortunately, nowadays, if a baby's going to be born with Tay-Sachs, usually they're not Jewish. It's from couples who didn't know they should get tested. In our community, it's very, very rare for babies to be born with Tay-Sachs, thank God. And we still have a lot of work to do. We also think it's important to not only save Jewish babies, obviously, we want to save all babies. So that's a big part of my job, is to go around to everybody, but I'm, especially passionate about our community. But you can see it really, really makes a difference to test people and to provide this counseling to them. Nowadays, I said we're testing for many, many more conditions. Here's a list of just a couple of them. These are the more common ones that are seen in people who are Ashkenazi Jewish. You might recognize some of the names. You probably don't recognize most of them, but these are kind of just like the more common ones that you'll see in people who are Ashkenazi. So we see carriers all the time for people for these conditions. Some facts about Jewish genetic diseases is that 80% of babies who have these Jewish genetic diseases have no family history. And the reason that they have no family history is because carriers don't have symptoms. The only way to have a baby with the disease is if mom and dad are both carriers, which doesn't happen that often. So most of the time, the carrier status is going from generation to generation to generation within a family, and nobody knows because they're not marrying other carriers. So the carrier status just will continue to keep going and going and going. But when babies are actually born with it, usually they're the first in the family to be born because the parents are only asymptomatic carriers. Because we're testing for so many conditions, most people that we test are positive for at least one condition. Here it says that about 75% of our patients are going to be positive. When I wrote this slide a few months ago, that was true, but we have since updated our testing panel, and now we're testing for even more conditions, and I think the number is probably even higher by now. So the more things you test for, the more positives there's going to be. And that's why most people who come through JScreen are positive for something, which is fine. It's not a big deal because, again, carriers are healthy. And it's always better to find out that you're a carrier by getting screened than by finding out the hard way, having a baby who's affected with one of these conditions. So who should do the testing? Anybody who's considering a pregnancy. So even if somebody's considering a second or third or fourth pregnancy, they're adding to their family, not just their first, they should consider testing. If they've already been tested in previous pregnancies, they should check in and see if new testing is available. I just mentioned now that a couple months ago, we updated our testing panel. So people who were tested only, as late as like July, we're tested for our older panel, and now we're testing for many more. So it's important that anytime somebody has a baby, they make sure that their testing is up to date, and they should not be relying on old testing, which Audrey kind of hinted to in the beginning of our conversation. So very often we'll have people come back for, round 2 or round 3 of testing between their babies. It's important that everybody get tested, not just people who are Ashkenazi. Anybody could be a carrier for anything. I mentioned that Tay-Sachs babies are still being born to non-Jewish parents. Anybody can be a carrier for anything. These things are just more common in people who are Ashkenazi. Doesn't make a difference if they're not Jewish at all, if they're same-sex couples. Anybody having a baby needs to get tested. Where can they get tested? I obviously put JScreen at the top because that's where I am. So I am very passionate about what we do at JScreen, which I'll talk about more a little bit later. Some people go directly to a genetic counselor. That I would recommend if there's something else going on that's not just like the standard, I want to have a baby, I need to get tested. But let's say there's a family history of something, or something extra going on that needs more personalized attention. I would say JScreen is probably not the answer, and they should go speak to somebody about their personal history that's going on in their family. And doctors can also do it. So OBGYNs will do the testing. Sometimes pediatricians will do the testing for their older patients. I do want to give a warning that physicians are generally really good at their specialty, hopefully, but they don't necessarily know so much about genetics and all the new things that are coming out in genetics. So very often I'll see patients of mine who had already gotten tested by their doctor, and when I ask for the results, I see that the doctor ordered a test that's like a little bit old school. Like they're not doing the best test just because they don't know it exists. It's not on purpose, but they just don't realize that there's better tests out there. So if somebody is going to do it through their doctor, it's important that they just make sure that the doctor is doing the most up-to-date test they have. If not, obviously they're welcome to come to us. And when to do the testing, it's always best to test before a pregnancy versus during a pregnancy, because in case there is a problem where a couple is at risk, they'll have more options if they're not already pregnant. What do we tell carriers? The first thing is that it's important to tell other people that you're a carrier, whether it's a partner, which is obvious that partners need to be tested if they're a carrier. Their relatives, these things run in families, so siblings have a 50% chance to carry whatever their siblings carry. And we also tell them that it's not a big deal to be a carrier. I just told you that most people are positive. So it's kind of normal and typical to be positive, and there are options for carrier couples. So no longer are we those people in the vans going around telling people not to get married if they're a carrier couple. Nowadays, we're giving them many, many more options. So
Sorry, I see, I think your screen, I think you might want to, I don't know if you wanted to stop your slides, but they're not visible right now.
oh, I don't know what happened. Okay, I'm going to close it and open it again. Hang on. Hmm. Do you see it now? Yeah, okay. So when we have carrier couples, we talk to them about all the different options that they have. Here I put down a list of the options that we discussed. I will say that the conversation is completely different for every single couple that I'm talking to. It depends on so many things, like the direction of the conversation will depend on what the condition is. Is it serious? Is it mild? How long have the people known each other? Are they already married, or did they go on only one date? Are they 21 and in the dating scene, or are they in their late 30s and they finally found someone? So the conversation is always very, very personalized to that couple. But the one thing that's in common is that all of these different options are presented to them, and then we have a conversation about what makes the most sense for them. So at the top, I put natural conception with option for prenatal testing. A normal pregnancy is about 40 weeks long. So when we have a carrier couple, we tell them that about 11 or 12 weeks in the pregnancy, they could do a test called chorionic villus sampling, or CVS, where they take a needle, put it through the belly, and take out a little bit of the placenta. Whatever is happening in the placenta should reflect what's going on in the baby. So it's a way of getting baby cells without actually touching the baby. They send those cells off to the lab, and the lab will tell us what's going on in the baby. Does the baby have the condition, or does the baby not have the condition? So you could know very early on in a pregnancy what the status is, and kind of take it from there, which also is a very general statement. Take it from there could mean everything's good. We don't have to worry about the baby. If they see that there is a problem and the baby is affected, the couple might decide to either terminate an affected pregnancy or to continue it with the knowledge that the baby's going to be affected. And there's a lot of issues there that we don't need to discuss now, but I will tell you that having worked with the Jewish community for many, many years, there are many, many places within halacha where it is allowed for couples to terminate a pregnancy. So that's where I leave it off to the rabbi. But I do want to say that it certainly is a conversation worth having in some cases. Other couples who are not comfortable with that, or who might not already be pregnant and are thinking about how to get pregnant, might decide for the second option, which is in vitro fertilization, or IVF, with pre-implantation genetic testing. So some of you might already be familiar with IVF and what it is. You probably have heard of it in the realm of couples who are having fertility problems, they can't get pregnant. IVF in a nutshell, in a very basic summary of what it is the woman gives an egg sample, the man gives a sperm sample, they fertilize the egg in the lab, they let it grow, they let that embryo grow for a few days, and then they transfer it into the woman's uterus, and hopefully she gets pregnant with that baby, with that embryo. What I'm suggesting here is that they do IVF, where they make that embryo in the lab, and then after a few days, here's a picture of the embryo. The embryo is a few cells big or old, I don't know what to say, but it's a few cells. They take out a few of those cells, send it off to the lab for genetic testing, and then the lab will tell us, does the baby have the condition in question or not? And they'll only use embryos that are unaffected with the condition. So it's, essentially a way to avoid getting pregnant at all with a baby who's going to be affected. So they don't have to deal with issues of termination and questions like that. And they know right away that everything's going to be okay with this baby. Like I said before, there's a lot of room in halakha for IVF. Many rabbis actually prefer this over some of the other options that I have written, but it's very case by case. And speak to your local rabbi about that. IVF is an incredible, incredible, incredible opportunity for carrier couples that did not exist in the 70s and 80s. So I'm so happy that so many couples get to use it. But I will say that it's not easy. Some of you might know people or have been through IVF yourself. It is not a walk in the park to go through the process. And we talk about, the pros and cons and what it would mean for a couple. Other couples might decide to use other forms of assisted reproductive technologies, like they might use a donor egg or sperm who's not a carrier, so you don't have a problem of a carrier couple. Some couples will decide not to have children together biologically at all. They might adopt or foster. Some couples who are earlier on in the relationship might decide to just stop dating and not have to deal with making these decisions. And some couples might decide not to have children at all. So again, each and every couple is completely unique, and we have these very long, detailed discussions about what makes the most sense for them when they get their results. It's also helpful for carrier couples to talk to their doctors, to sometimes consult with a rabbi, like I said, and very often they'll like to speak to other people who have been in similar situations to kind of get their take on, how did it go for you? So part of our counseling is just, talking them through it and helping them and guiding them to make the decision that makes the most sense for them. So as you can see, genetic counselors do a lot of genetics, but we also do a lot of counseling. There's a lot of psychosocial, emotional aspects to doing our job. One more thing before we get on to cancer is I just want to say that even though today we've been very, very focused on Jewish people, Tay-Sachs, African Americans have sickle cell, people of different populations have different conditions. Not all genetic diseases have to do with your ethnicity. You don't have to be Jewish to have a genetic disease. There are some diseases that have nothing to do with one's ethnicity. For example, Down syndrome. You probably have all heard of Down syndrome before. Down syndrome happens when the mom, most of the time, gives an extra chromosome that has to do with her age. So it has nothing to do with her ethnic background. Sometimes things happen spontaneously. So not all genetic diseases have to do with one's ethnicity. Those are just the ones that we're focused on today, because these are things that we can prevent, and we could, figure out before it becomes a problem. Now I'll move on to cancer genetic testing, which is like a totally different part of genetic testing. And then we'll talk about JScreen specifically, and then we'll leave room for questions. So if we look at cancer, totally shifting gears here, if we're looking at cancer, most cancers happen by chance. Most of them are sporadic. Only about 5 to 10% of cases of cancer are hereditary, happen within a family. Most of the time, when they're sporadic, we can't really predict whether they're going to happen or not. But when we're dealing with hereditary cancers, there is something that we can do about it. And very often we'll decide who would be a good candidate for testing or who should be tested based on some clues or some red flags that we might see in their family. So for example, you might see a lot of people on the same side of the family with the same types of cancer or related types of cancer. You might see people getting cancer at very young ages. Being Ashkenazi Jewish puts somebody at risk to be a carrier for a BRCA or a BRCA mutation. So just like Tay-Sachs is more common in Ashkenazi people, so is BRCA more common in people who are Ashkenazi. So anybody could get cancer, and most cancers are not due to genetic reasons, but sometimes we're a little bit more suspicious that there is something genetic when we see, for example, when we see any of these things. I'm going to use the two BRCA genes as an example of cancer genes, but there are many, many more. At JScreen, we're now testing for 48 cancer genes. So this is just two of them, BRCA1 and BRCA2. When somebody has a change or a mutation in a cancer gene, that predisposes them to getting cancer. It doesn't mean that they're for sure going to get cancer, but it means that they have a higher than average chance to get cancer. And depending on which gene we're talking about, the numbers and the risks and the cancer types is going to be totally different. So again, I'm just using BRCA1 and BRCA2 as an example, but a chart like this would look completely different for any of the other genes that we're testing for. So let's start with the BRCA, with how the BRCA genes can affect women. So the general population risk for breast cancer is about 12%. So about 12% of women get breast cancer. However, if somebody has a BRCA1 mutation or a BRCA2 mutation, that risk is up to 87%. So general population and women with a mutation. It's not 100%, so it's not a guarantee that a woman with a mutation will get breast cancer, but the risk is quite significant. For ovarian cancer is not as common as breast cancer. Less than 2% of women get ovarian cancer. But with a mutation in either BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, that risk increases also quite significantly. The risk is a little bit higher in women with a BRCA1 mutation versus a BRCA2 mutation, but even with BRCA2, it's significantly higher than that 2%. Men can also have BRCA mutations. They're equally found in men and women, but the way that it presents itself is very different in men and women. The way that it would present itself in a man would be with breast cancer and also prostate cancer. Male breast cancer is not common at all. About 0.1% of men get it, but with a BRCA mutation, that risk is increased. It's higher in BRCA2 than BRCA1. The risk for prostate cancer is about 16% for men, but with a mutation, it's about double that. And in addition to all of this, men and women who have a mutation have an increased risk for pancreatic cancer. Also not a very common cancer in the general population, but the risk is increased for people who have a mutation. So again, BRCA1 and BRCA2 are just examples of cancer genes. There are many, many more. And when I'm talking to somebody who's positive, our conversation is very, very specific, to whatever the gene is that we're talking about. When somebody does test positive, we don't just say, you have a high chance of getting cancer, have a good day. We talk to them about how they can use this information to stay healthy and to prevent or find cancer at an early stage. So one thing that we might say is that if you know you have an increased risk for certain cancers, you might want to do cancer screening more frequently or earlier. So for example, let's say somebody tests positive for a colon cancer gene and they're in their 30s, let's just say. Instead of waiting till they're 50 for their first colonoscopy, like most people do, they might start doing their colonoscopies younger. They might start at 40. And instead of doing it every 10 years, they'll do it every 5 years. So that's an example of starting earlier and doing it more often. Screening for cancer basically means just looking for it for people who are not symptomatic of cancer. So it just means looking for it. So they might look for it more frequently. The reason to do that, to start early and more frequently, is because if it's going to happen, better to catch it earlier. The earlier you catch things, the more treatable it's going to be. So I just gave you that example of the colonoscopy, but there's many, many other examples. For men who test positive for a prostate cancer gene, they'll start doing their PSA blood tests a little bit earlier. Women who are positive for breast cancer genes that are younger might start doing their mammograms or even breast MRIs a little bit younger. But the point is, catch it early if it's going to happen. Sometimes we'll talk about lifestyle changes like diet and exercise. When we're talking to somebody who already has a cancer diagnosis, they obviously can't prevent it and they're not screening for it, but sometimes there are very specific treatments that are targeted at cancer cells that happen because of genetic mutations. So they'll use certain medications for people who are BRCA positive versus other chemotherapy medications because they're more effective in those cases. So it could even be helpful for people who are already affected with cancer. In some cases, we might talk about risk-reducing surgeries. So for people who don't have cancer, who have a high chance, in some cases, they will remove that organ or part of that organ to prevent or to stop themselves from getting cancer. So, for example, when a woman tests positive for a BRCA mutation, it is always recommended that they remove their ovaries by the time they're done having their kids. Or by the time they're 40, because the risk is so high for ovarian cancer and it's very hard to detect it early. So it's better to remove the ovaries so you don't have to worry about that risk. That's just an example. And here you can see some other examples. When we're talking to younger people who have a mutation, who are thinking about their family planning, we also talk to them about doing IVF with PGT, which we spoke about earlier with Tay-Sachs, where you make an embryo outside the body and then they do genetic testing on it and only use embryos without Tay-Sachs or whatever that condition is. Same idea here. If a family knows that one of the parents has a BRCA mutation, they might decide to also do IVF to avoid passing along that mutation to their children. So just like with carrier couples with Tay-Sachs and those other conditions, when people test positive for a cancer gene, we have a really long conversation about what they can do with this information. I just want to make it clear that it's not just breast cancer. I know I gave the BRCA genes as an example, but as I also mentioned, there are many other cancers that are genetic. And it's not just BRCA. So when we're talking about breast cancer, for example, we talked about the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 genes, but there are other breast cancer genes that are not BRCA1 and BRCA2 that are also involved in breast cancer. So just something that I see very often that I don't want to forget, people will say to me, oh, I did the BRCA test in 2004 and I was negative, so I don't have to worry about it. Well, in 2004, those are the only two cancer genes we knew about. Now we know about all these other breast cancer genes. So even though somebody might have been negative for these two, it doesn't mean they're negative for all these other ones. So it is essential that when somebody suspects that there's a hereditary cancer syndrome, they make sure that they have up-to-date testing, because they're just going to be covering more and checking for more. How are these mutations inherited? So this is not the same as the P-plants and Tay-Sachs. This kind of inheritance is called dominant inheritance. When somebody has a mutation, each of their children has a 50% chance of getting that mutation from them. It doesn't make a difference if they're male or female, it's 50%. And if that person gets it, then all the cancer risks that we spoke about or that we would speak about apply to them. So it's 50-50 for every child, and each child is completely independent from the other. So it doesn't mean if one has it, the other one won't. Each one is 50-50. I did mention earlier that being Ashkenazi Jewish puts people at extra risk for certain cancer mutations, specifically for BRCA. The general population risk to be a BRCA or BRCA carrier is about 1 in 500. Ashkenazi Jews is about 1 in 40. So about the same carrier frequency as Tay-Sachs. So that's quite significant. And it's a reason that I'm a big proponent of all Ashkenazis getting tested for it, even if they don't have a family history. Why is it that some people might have a mutation and not have a family history? Like, why is it that people test positive when we wouldn't expect them to test positive? There are many reasons. Some reasons is that some people have small families. So even though the mutation is there aren't enough people to have gotten it because it's a small family. Very often we'll have limited information about a family. So people don't necessarily talk about things or know about things. Think about in our history, think about the Holocaust, right? Like so many people who died in the Holocaust wouldn't, maybe they would have gotten these cancers had they lived longer. We just don't know. So we don't have that much information about many people. Some families just have a lot of guys in the family. So even though the mutation is there, you're not seeing it present itself because they're not getting ovarian cancer and breast cancer. And like I said, family communication, people don't always talk about it. And finally, like I said a few times already, not everybody with a mutation will get cancer. So just because somebody has a mutation, it is not a guarantee that they'll get cancer. So maybe people have mutations and they're just not showing themselves because not everybody gets cancer. So I personally believe, and I think everybody at JScreen also believes, that anybody who's Ashkenazi should highly consider getting tested, even if they don't have a family history, just because the risk is so high and the reward for getting tested is also so high. Knowing that you're positive can save your life because there's something that you can do about it. I'll end off with some information about what we do at JScreen. Here you could read through our mission, which is very wordy. You don't have to read it, but basically our mission is to test people and give them information about themselves that they can use to plan for their futures, which I think is, you saw that theme in both of the topics that we already discussed. Our two tests that we offer are our reproductive carrier screen and our hereditary cancer test. I mentioned for our reproductive carrier screening that we're currently testing for 265 diseases, and it's appropriate for anybody in their um, child baby making time period. Again, even for people who already have a child or two and are planning for more, anybody, man, woman, black, white, Jewish, non-Jewish, everybody should get tested when they're planning for a family. Our hereditary cancer test, we're testing for 40 different cancer genes. And same idea, anybody who's interested in getting this information should get tested. JScreen is an at-home genetic testing program, so it doesn't make a difference where you are in the United States. You can get tested. All you need to do is go to our website at jscreen.org and you request a spit kit. You'll receive the kit in the mail. You spit into the tube, send it back, and then the results come back by telehealth. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can get tested for either of these two tests that we offer. How does the billing work? So when you register for your kit, you will pay $49. That's kind of like an upfront program fee to be part of the JScreen program. Doesn't make a difference if you're doing the carrier screening test or the cancer test, it's $49. If you decide to do both, there is a discounted price of $69 instead of $49 twice. Then the rest of it gets billed to your insurance. So depending on what your insurance covers, it's going to be a different number. The way that the lab handles it is they don't just like throw bills at people without them expecting it. They always send a cost estimate to you before they run the test, just to check with you that you're okay with whatever that price is. If it's more than $249, they'll give you the option to forego your insurance and just pay the self-pay price, which is $249. So it should be anywhere between $0 and $249 for that testing. Most people are covered mostly, but sometimes people haven't met their deductibles or there's co-insurance. So it's not, I can't say that everybody pays nothing. That's certainly not true, but most of the time this is covered to some extent by insurance. And that's the end. This is my contact information if anybody has any questions. And now I will open up the floor to questions for now.
Thank you, Esty. That was great. Very much appreciated. I'm going to offer if somebody would like to raise their hand, they can use the hand emoji. If you want to unmute and ask a question, you can also put a question into the chat. And so I'm going to wait for that. I have a question that had come up earlier before the program, so I'll start with that while people are thinking. Well, first of all, just specific about JScreen. In the last slide that you showed, you talked about how you do the test and the costs and insurance, et cetera. So there's two questions regarding that. One is, are there separate tests for the cancer screening and for the, what should I call it?
We talk about carrier screening.
The carrier screening. Thank you. Are they two separate tests?
Yeah, they are two separate tests because, as we all saw, they're apples and oranges. You get such different information, and we don't want to confuse people. We don't want people to think they're getting a Tay-Sachs test and then find out that they're a BRCA carrier. So if they're not ready for that information, they're not ready for it, and we don't want to throw it all at once at people. So there are two completely different tests. It's the same lab that happens to run the test, but they're in completely different divisions of the lab, completely separate.
Okay. And I know that some people have concerns. Sometimes people don't want to use their health insurance, even if it's covered. They're worried that results could potentially affect health insurance rates and or life insurance rates. A lot of times people will ask if they should buy life insurance before they test, especially for the cancer screenings.
Yeah, no, it's a real question. Yeah,
Okay.
we see this all the time. I had a patient today actually who registered not with her full name. She just gave her initials because, and she also chose to do the self-pay price and not even bill her insurance. She didn't want her insurance company to know that she was doing the test. And I understand why. Obviously what we're doing is very clinically based, and we're doing everything very kosher in terms of privacy and HIPAA compliance and all that. But sometimes information in one way or another gets into the wrong hands, and it really could be a concern for people. So I will say for health insurance that your health insurance might or might not be affected by this. Most of the time, it is not affected. There is a law called the GINA law, which prevents certain types of insurances from discriminating against people based on their results. So, for example, health insurance is there. It's a federal law that's state by state. It's like interpreted state by state. So that's why I'm being a little bit general here. But generally speaking, somebody cannot be denied coverage or their premium can't be totally out of control if they are positive. Like the insurance companies can't use that against them and charge them a higher premium or not let them be part of the plan. Same thing with employment discrimination. People can't get fired because they find out their employer finds out that they're a BRCA carrier, or they can't not get that promotion. Like that's not allowed. There is a federal law because, for that. However, this law does not cover other things that seem to make people concerned. You mentioned life insurance. The GINA law does not cover life insurance. So if somebody is positive for a mutation, specifically in a cancer gene, for example, and that means that they have a higher chance to get cancer, the insurance companies, if they find out, if they know that somebody's positive, they can say, sure, we'll let you on our plan, but we're going to charge you triple what we charged our last client, because we know that you have a higher chance of getting cancer and needing to use this insurance. Same thing with disability insurance and long-term care insurance. So unfortunately, there's nothing stopping these insurance companies from using somebody's genetic information against them. Sometimes they ask, sometimes they don't ask when people apply for these policies, but you never know. And if they ask, they could potentially use it against you. So
Thank you.
yeah, it could be a little bit scary. And that's, by the way, this is like a very big part of our counseling. Before anybody does a cancer test, we tell them this because we don't want them to come back 4 months later when they're positive and say, whoa, because of this, I can't get, my kids are never going to get my life insurance, So we tell them, if you're not ready to do this test because you don't have these insurances, wait, get the insurance and then do the test, because you're not hiding anything if you don't have the test. But once you have those results, you have those results and you can't undo that.
Thank you. That's an important point, that it's less likely that you would be kicked off your life insurance if you already have it. It's always
Right,
people to
exactly.
buy that
They
in
don't ask.
advance of having the test.
Exactly. Yeah, it's only when you're applying, that's when they might ask.
Yeah.
And they don't always ask. But if they do and you have information, you got to share it.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a question in the chat um, that I'm sure has come up for you before. Somebody's asking if you can discuss the differences between JScreen, which is an open testing model where you're giving the results to the person, and something like Doria Sharam, which is a closed testing model where people, well, I'll let you explain the difference.
Yeah, so I'll start with a little bit. I'll explain Dory Sharam. You all know the JScreen model, so I'll explain what Dory Sharam is and how we're different from them. So Dory Sharam is a community organization that started in, I think, the early 90s by a Satmar Hasidic family named the Ecksteins. The Ecksteins, unfortunately, had 4 babies who died from Tay-Sachs disease. And they watched 4 of their kids die, and they said, we can't let this happen to other people. And they went out into their community and they said, you guys got to get tested. Like, this shouldn't happen to you like it happened to us. And the community was not interested in this because they felt that once the word gets out that we're Tay-Sachs carriers, nobody's going to want to marry us. In that community specifically, it's, everything is based on a shidduch system. And you probably have all heard of the shidduch resumes and the dating game and the matchmakers and everything. And this is just, not good for your shidduch resume if people find out that you're a carrier. So the Ecksteins came up with this genius idea where they would test people to see if they were Tay-Sachs carriers, but they wouldn't give them their results. Instead, they would just give them an ID number. And when a guy and a girl were ready to go out on the first date, both of them would call the Dory Sharam hotline with their ID numbers, and Dory Sharam would do the comparison for them and either say, you're a match or you're not a match. You're a match means either one of you or neither of you is a carrier, and not a match means both of you are carriers. And if you're not a match, they say, don't even bother going out on the first date. So it was really smart, right? Because it was a way to get people tested like they should be in a way that was culturally appropriate and acceptable to that community. And I credit them so much for what they've done because they have pretty much eradicated Tay-Sachs and put it on the map. So I think it's really great that they did that. And over the course of years, as more and more was known about these genes, just like what we did at JScreen or precursor to JScreen, is they've added more diseases to their testing panel, and it's not just Tay-Sachs anymore. The differences between what they do and what we do is what Audrey had said, the open versus the closed testing. Open testing, what we do is we are open with you about your results. We give them to you. Closed testing is people don't know their results. And it's still like that today. So they still give out the ID number and they don't tell people their results. You basically only know your results if you don't match with somebody, right? That if they tell you you're not a match, then you kind of figure out that you're positive for something. But other than that, people have no idea what they're carriers for. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that they do not test for many diseases for a reason. They're very clear about that. While we at JScreen keep adding more and more diseases to our panel, they are very stuck in, I don't know exactly how many they're testing for, something in the 40s or maybe 50 diseases. And they don't plan on doing any more than that. The reason is because they perceive themselves as a matchmaking organization, not as a genetic testing organization, which they're not. They don't have genetic counselors. They're not geneticists. They don't want to break up shidduchim. They don't want to break up matches. So the more things you test for, as I mentioned much earlier on, the more positives you're going to find. So they don't want to test for things and break up shidduchim unless there's a really, really, really good reason to do it. So we're testing for more than them and we're getting results. And we're also providing, obviously, the counseling part. A lot of people ask me, well, which one should I do? And I hate to say it, but just as somebody with a background in genetics, I don't think Dory Charm is the answer. I hate to say it because I think they have done great things for the community, but they're not testing for enough. They were testing for more than 200 more diseases and we're finding carrier couples for them. So, you always think to yourself, like, if it was me, I want to get the best test. So how can I not tell that to other people? So I clinically believe that it's better to get tested for more using a better test. We are also using much better technology than them and we're catching carriers that they're not catching. So while I respect them for all that they've done, I just wish they would test for more and then I'd be totally fine with it. I'm okay with the open versus closed. If that works in that community, that's fine. But clinically speaking, they're under testing and they're missing carrier couples. Hopefully one day they'll change and they'll add more diseases to their testing panel.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for explaining that. And I guess also a follow-up question to that is JScreen has the option for the cancer testing. Does Dor Yesharim have an option for cancer testing? Cancer
No,
screening?
because again, they're the purpose of their program is matchmaking and cancer predisposition is not in that realm.
Okay, thank you. We're going to just leave it open for any additional questions. Oh, so somebody's asking, what's the accuracy of the testing? Are there such a thing as false positives?
So false positives, we don't really see. We're using this great lab that's approved. It's one of the biggest labs out there, and they have a lot of quality control along the way. So you don't really see false positives. False negatives with any genetic test, whether it's our lab or any other lab, there's always going to be a teeny tiny chance that they could have missed something. I mentioned that we're using excellent technology. It's called sequencing, which basically means that they look at the entire gene from the front of it to the back of it. So the chances that they're going to miss something is extremely, extremely low. But no test is perfect. And you'll see on any lab report for any lab that no test should say it has 100% detection rate. There's always a tiny chance they can miss something. So I trust the results, whatever they are, I trust them.
Thank you. And let's see, any other questions here in the chat? Is there, okay, I think you addressed this before, but just to give you a chance, how often should I get tested? You sort of alluded to that earlier, but if people are between pregnancies, if people are not intending to get pregnant, is there a reason to get any type of genetic testing at different stages of life?
Yeah, so if they're not intending to get pregnant, there's no reason to do the reproductive carrier screen. I think it used to be like I remember my parents got tested when me and my siblings were getting married because they thought if we get tested and we're negative, then the kids don't have to get tested. I think that's like a common thing that people used to do. We don't recommend that anymore. Now we just say if you're the one getting married, you should be the one getting tested. So people who are beyond reproductive age should not be doing the carrier screening test. There's no reason to. Doesn't really make a difference what their results are. For the hereditary cancer test, things do change over time. So if there's reason to believe that you might have something going on in your family and it hasn't come up as positive, maybe it's worth it to, check in and get retested with newer testing. There's no magic number because these things, the labs come out with new tests randomly. It's not like every January they come out with a new test. It really just depends on what's new. So I can't give an exact number, but I would say it's certainly worth it for you to check in. You're welcome to email me and say, hey, I was tested. These are my past results. Is it worthwhile for me to get retested? And then I'll let you know based on whatever those results say. And very often, I wouldn't say very often, but often we'll see people come back positive even though they were negative the first time around. We've come a really long way.
So just two more questions. One, are there any other conditions besides for cancer that are dominant and that you test for or that anybody tests for?
Yes and no. There are many that, but we don't test for them. There are cardiogenetic syndromes that are dominant. There are neurological conditions that are dominant. We don't test for either of those. There are muscular dystrophies and muscular issues that are dominant. We're not testing for all of those. For a lot of those, it's recommended that people see a doctor where they need to get like a physical evaluation to see whether, to see what kind of testing makes the most sense for them. So that's not really so conducive to telehealth. It's just not the right time and place for it. We think they should be seeing a doctor physically.
Okay, so if somebody has concerns in one of these other areas, they should talk to their doctor about what genetic tests might be available. Or
Exactly.
okay,
Exactly. Yeah.
okay. Um, and that's one question. Let's see if we can find that. Maybe not. Okay. Well, oh, there is another question here. What age range do you recommend starting the cancer screening?
That's a really good question. It's a loaded question.
Yeah.
I would say it depends on so many factors. I don't think an 18-year-old needs to know. But if the information might be useful for IVF purposes, then you might want to test younger. Specifically for breast cancer genes, the recommendations for screening don't start until age 25. So the youngest somebody would do something about it if they're positive, a woman would do something about it if she's positive would be age 25. She'll start getting mammograms. So is there really a reason to test a 22-year-old? Probably not, because if she's positive, she's just sitting with that information, which could be burdensome on her. Mentally and sometimes in the shidduch world also that could be quite a burden on a woman to know that she's positive. So I don't love testing very young people, but by the time they're in their mid 20s early 30s it might be worthwhile if there's a high chance that they'll be positive. So I would say like mid 20s to 100 is a good time to get tested, and again each case is different.
Okay. And I think last question, are there any preventative measures for people who test positive for, I guess, the BRCA genes for either prostate cancer and or pancreatic cancer?
No for both. For prostate cancer, no, it's just a lot of early screening. And pancreatic cancer, there's nothing preventative either. It's also early screening through endoscopy and MRI.
Okay.
This could change, so just
Mhm.
like the disease panels change over time, so do the recommendations. There are national guidelines for every single gene that we test for. When people test positive, it's tell them X, Y, and Z. Start screening at this age, do the surgery by that age for every single gene. And these guidelines get updated all the time. So hopefully one day the answer will be yes for both of those questions that you asked, but for right now, no.
Okay. Okay. Very good. All right. Thank you. I think if there are no more last minute questions, We're going to end it here, but if people certainly can email if they have some follow-ups, and I will also send out a follow-up email to everybody who registered with more information about JScreen, how to get in touch there, and uh, and uh, and recording potentially if somebody is interested in getting that. I just want to thank Esty again. Thank you so much. This is such important information, truly potentially life-saving information. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep current on these matters and to speak to our physicians, genetic counselors, and our family members to understand more about our own family health histories as well. So thank you, much appreciated. And thank you everybody who came to join us tonight, and stay safe out there in the snow, wherever you are.